Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful and transformative tales that touch the heart. Today's story is about redemption, the power of music, and the unexpected connections that change lives. It follows David Williams, a gifted vocalist turned waiter, and Catherine Walker, a successful real estate developer who learns the true value of privilege and second chances. Together, they embark on a journey that will challenge their assumptions and create a legacy of healing through music. Please subscribe to our channel to begin today's story, and stay tuned for more life-changing narratives. It was a quiet, ordinary evening in Manhattan, though for David Williams, the night was anything but ordinary. For the past 8 years, he had walked the polished floors of the Golden Laurel, one of the city's most prestigious restaurants, where the world of the wealthy, the powerful, and the famous collided. He had always felt out of place in that world, with its gilded walls and crystal chandeliers. The patrons, dressed in designer clothes, seemed so far removed from the life he had once dreamed of. David had once walked the halls of Juilliard, not as a waiter, but as a rising star in the world of classical music. But dreams had a way of fading. And for David, it was the realities of life, unforeseen setbacks and the harshness of the world, that dimmed the brilliance of his potential. David had learned to carry the weight of his silenced dream with quiet dignity. Every evening, he donned his uniform and slipped into the rhythm of his work. His movements were graceful, precise, the result of years of discipline not only in the restaurant but in the music he had abandoned. The subtle, practiced perfection he poured into his work was a quiet protest against the life he had been forced into. Yet, he did not complain. He had learned that the small victories, the moments when he helped a trembling new waiter or reassured a frightened customer, could be enough. In the quiet solace of the service hall, he would often hum the melodies his grandmother had taught him, just for a moment, letting the music rise from his heart before he submerged it back into the deep well of his soul. On this particular evening, the restaurant hummed with the typical clinking of silverware and murmurs of conversations. The night was still young, and David, as always, moved through the space with practiced ease. His eyes were sharp, attuned to the smallest details: a crooked fork, a water glass that had been left half full, the faintest smudge on the fine linen. Every moment was a step in a ritual he knew all too well. He was invisible yet visible, serving with the utmost professionalism while remaining unseen by those who mattered. Then, she arrived. Catherine Walker was an undeniable presence in the room. At just 29, she had already made partner at one of the city's top real estate development firms, a feat she often mentioned in passing conversations. The pride in her voice unmistakable. Her high heels clicked against the marble floors as she walked through the door, her gold sequin dress catching the light in a way that made it seem like the entire room had been lit just for her. Catherine was accustomed to being noticed, to being admired. She had always carried herself with an air of invincibility, a queen in her own right, accustomed to bending the world around her to her will. As she approached the table, David caught a glimpse of her face, a perfect mask of confidence, tempered only by the gleam of the champagne she was sipping from. She was accompanied by a group of guests, all of whom seemed equally affluent, equally self-assured, each conversation as sharp and polished as their clothing. David greeted her with his usual professional smile, his eyes meeting hers briefly before she turned to her friends, ordering a round of champagne. He had long since learned to become a shadow, to serve without being seen, to move between the lines of the powerful without letting them see the man behind the waiter's uniform. But that night, something was different. David could feel the subtle shift in the air as Catherine turned to him, her gaze sharp and curious. She wasn't like the other patrons. She wasn't just asking for the menu, no. Her eyes bore into him with an intensity that made him pause for just a moment. "You," she said, her voice carrying across the table. "I bet you sing, don't you?" David stiffened, the question catching him off guard. He had learned to keep his voice hidden, to lock away the passion that still thrummed in his chest. Singing had been his life once, his escape, his joy, but he had buried it deep within. not just as a response to the world around him but as a safeguard against rejection. The cruel barbs of a society that didn't see him for his talent but for his place in it had taught him that lesson well. "I'm afraid I'm just a waiter, madam," he replied, his voice calm, measured, and polite. He felt the weight of the lie. But he said it anyway. Catherine's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a smile that, to David's discomfort, didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, come now," she said, almost coaxing. "Don't be modest. You must have a wonderful singing voice. All of you do, don't you? It's the way of your people, isn't it?" The words hung in the air like smoke, thick with condescension. The patrons around the table snickered, the tension growing palpable. David's hand tightened around the wineglass he was holding, his heart pounding in his chest. He had heard these types of remarks before, remarks laced with privilege, tinged with assumptions about what he was supposed to be, what he was expected to be. Every inch of him wanted to walk away, to refuse to play her cruel game. But something, maybe it was the memory of his grandmother, her unwavering belief in his talent, her insistence that he never hide it, kept him rooted to the spot. "Very well, Miss Walker," he said, his voice steady, though the words tasted bitter on his tongue. "If you insist." The moment he agreed, the room seemed to hold its breath. Catherine sat back in her chair, her smile widening as if she had won some trivial victory. She waved her hand toward him dismissively. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "our waiter here is going to favor us with a song. Let's all make him feel welcome." The room fell silent, all eyes on David, who stood at the edge of the table, his heart racing, his hands clammy. He could hear the whispers, feel the heat of their gazes, the judgment in their eyes. But amidst it all, he thought of his grandmother's words, whispered softly in his ear when he was young. "God gives you a gift, baby. You don't let it gather dust. You let it shine, no matter who's watching." With a deep breath, David closed his eyes, banishing all thoughts of judgment and ridicule. And then, he began to sing, "Amazing Grace." How sweet the sound! The notes rose from deep within him, rich and full, carrying with them all the weight of his hidden years. It was no longer just a song, it was a cry for something more. A cry for redemption. And as his voice filled the room, everything shifted. The judgment, the laughter, the privilege, it all melted away, leaving only the music. The first note of "Amazing Grace" echoed through the room like a force of nature. It was as though the very air itself had thickened with the weight of David's voice. His baritone, smooth and rich as aged whiskey, swept over the gathered patrons, stealing their breath and silencing their conversations. David had never intended for this song to become a spectacle. But in that moment, he realized the enormity of the opportunity he had been handed. Not just to sing, but to make a statement about who he was, what he could be, and what was too often hidden in plain sight. As the melody unfolded, something within David clicked. He was no longer standing before a group of people whose privilege was on full display. He was no longer the waiter, the servant. He was an artist, pouring his soul into the music. The same music that had once filled concert halls, that had once made critics and audiences alike stand in awe of his talent. It was all coming back to him. With every note he sang, every phrase he carried, his heart soared as he let the lyrics wash over him. Each word a reminder of what he had lost but also a promise of what he could reclaim. At first, the room was still, almost too quiet. The clinking of glasses, the subtle hum of background chatter, all faded into nothing. Even the kitchen had stilled. From the corner of his eye, David saw Chef Antoine, usually so filled with bustling energy, standing at the doorway, his eyes moist with unshed tears. The staff, too, had emerged from their stations, peeking around corners, drawn to the song. They, too, felt its power. Felt the pull of something greater than just a performance. It was a reclamation of a voice that had been silenced for too long. But it wasn't just the staff that was moved. Catherine sat frozen in her seat, her smile faltering, her hand trembling as the wineglass threatened to slip from her grasp. The smug, self-assured demeanor she had worn so confidently at the beginning of the evening had evaporated. In its place was a vulnerability she had long since hidden from the world. She watched David, her face pale, her eyes wide with something akin to shock. It wasn't just the perfection of his voice that rattled her, it was the raw emotion. The way his voice filled every corner of the restaurant, cutting through years of carefully constructed walls. She could feel the music reaching deep within her, cracking open a part of her that had long since been sealed off. David's voice soared higher, weaving through the final verses, his training shining through in every note. The crowd was completely still, transfixed by the beauty of the performance. And then, something incredible happened. The silence that had enveloped the room gave way to applause, spontaneous, overwhelming, and thunderous. It began slowly, hesitantly, and then grew, filling the space with an energy that rattled the glasses on the tables. Patrons stood, some wiping tears from their eyes, others clapping without shame or restraint. Chef Antoine was openly weeping, his hands covering his face as if he, too, had been waiting for this moment for years. Catherine remained seated, her face a mixture of confusion and sorrow. The applause, though loud, seemed to fade into the background as she remained motionless, her thoughts swirling. Her eyes were fixed on David, her expression lost in something deeper, something she could not explain. For a brief moment, David stopped singing, allowing the silence to settle once more. Before the final, lingering note drifted into the air, the room seemed to hold its breath. But Catherine, who had been so eager to humiliate David earlier, now found herself questioning everything she thought she knew. The smugness that had governed her every action that night had crumbled. And what was left in its place was something fragile, uncertain, something that even she could not control. As David finished the final line, he opened his eyes, his gaze falling on her. For a moment, they locked eyes, and in that exchange, something profound passed between them. It was no longer about the song. It wasn't about the performance. It was about something much deeper, recognition. Recognition of shared humanity. Of the pain that each of them carried. Of the unspoken connection between two souls who had been broken by a world that did not see them for who they truly were. The applause, which had initially been directed at David, now seemed to hold a different meaning. It was no longer about his voice or his artistry. It was about a moment of transformation. It was about how music, of all things, had broken through the rigid walls of privilege, class, and prejudice, revealing the deep cracks that lay beneath. And for Catherine, the evening's events had cracked open a door she had long since locked. She didn't know what it all meant yet, didn't understand why the tears welled up in her eyes as David sang, but in that moment, she knew something had changed. Something fundamental had shifted. Not just in David but in herself as well. And as she sat there, silently absorbing the weight of it all, she felt the stirring of an unfamiliar emotion, something like empathy. It was the beginning of something profound, a journey neither of them had expected. The next few days passed in a blur for David. The world felt different, the usual hum of the restaurant, the clinking of plates, the hushed murmurs of high society, it all seemed distant. As if he had stepped out of time. He couldn't shake the memory of that moment when he had sung Amazing Grace in front of those strangers. In front of Catherine, the applause still echoed in his mind. But it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the recognition, the understanding that had passed between them. Unspoken but profound. For the first time in years, David felt his heart beating in rhythm with something greater than survival. Catherine, too, had been changed. The night after the performance, she found herself restless, unable to settle. The hum of the city outside her penthouse window felt oppressive, suffocating. She hadn't been able to stop thinking about David, about the raw emotion in his voice. The depth of the pain she had glimpsed behind his eyes. She had seen something in him that she hadn't expected. In that moment of humiliation she had attempted to force upon him. She had unwittingly unearthed something she had buried long ago, her own guilt. Her own unresolved grief, the harsh walls of her carefully constructed life, built with the materials of wealth, status, and control, had cracked open. She saw herself, as if for the first time, through the lens of his song. She tried to shake it off, tried to focus on work, but the feeling gnawed at her, like a splinter lodged too deep to ignore. She found herself returning to the same thought. What if she could help him? What if she could right the wrongs of her own privilege? What if David didn't have to stay hidden, his talent locked away by the same prejudices that had held him down all these years? But she didn't know where to start. After all, how could she fix something so deeply rooted in the world's unfairness? It was the following evening when she finally made the decision. Catherine called the Golden Laurel to ask when David would be working again. She needed to speak with him, to apologize for the cruelty of her actions and, perhaps more importantly, to offer him something that might set him on a path she had only just realized was his right all along. David arrived for his shift that evening with the same quiet resolve that had carried him through each of the years at the Golden Laurel. He was used to being invisible, to performing his job with quiet dignity. He did his work without fanfare, without complaint. But when he saw Catherine sitting at a corner table, her usual demeanor absent, he felt a jolt in his chest. She was different, not just in the way she was sitting there but in the stillness of her gaze. There was something in her eyes, a look of vulnerability and regret, that unsettled him. As he approached her table, his heart thudded in his chest. He had no idea what this conversation might bring. "David," Catherine said softly, her voice uncharacteristically gentle, "I need to apologize. I've been thinking about what happened, and I realize now how wrong I was. I humiliated you, and I'm deeply sorry for that." David stood still for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He had expected this apology to come with more excuses, more justifications, but there was none of that. Instead, there was only raw honesty. He could see that she was no longer the woman who had prided herself on wielding her privilege as a weapon. Something had changed in her. "I'm sorry too," David said quietly, his voice steady but laced with a hint of emotion. "I've hidden who I am for so long. It wasn't just you, it's the world, the way people like you see people like me." Catherine looked at him, her expression softening. "You don't have to hide anymore," she said, almost pleadingly. "I want to help you. I want to give you the opportunities you deserve." David shook his head. "I've had my chances," he said softly. "They just weren't enough. Not because of me, but because of the color of my skin. I learned to stop fighting for things I couldn't change." Catherine leaned forward, a look of determination on her face. "That's not true. What you need isn't charity, David. What you need is a chance. I'm offering you a chance to rebuild what was taken from you. You have the talent. You deserve to be seen." David hesitated, the offer swirling in his mind like a dream he hadn't dared to entertain for years. "What kind of chance are you offering?" he asked quietly. "I'm reopening my mother's music school," she replied. "It's called Harmony House. It was a place where anyone, regardless of their background, could learn music. I want you to help me run it. To teach. It's not about charity. It's about giving you the platform you've earned, the recognition you deserve." David's heart skipped a beat. This was everything he had ever dreamed of, a chance to teach. To share his gift with others. To help young people who had been overlooked. Just like he had been. But the shadows of his past, the scars left by years of rejection and discrimination, made him wary. "I'm not sure," David said, his voice filled with uncertainty. "It's been so long since I've sung in public. I don't know if I'm ready to step back into that world." Catherine's eyes softened, and she reached out, her hand touching his lightly. "You're not alone in this. I'll be with you every step of the way. We can rebuild this together. It's not about proving anything to anyone. It's about doing what's right." David looked into her eyes and saw something genuine. Something that transcended her previous arrogance. He saw a woman who was truly offering him a second chance. Not just for himself but for others like him. After a long pause, David finally nodded. "Okay, I'll do it. For my grandmother. For all the people who never had the chance." Catherine smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Thank you, David. I promise this is only the beginning." The days that followed felt like a whirlwind for David. The decision to teach at Harmony House, Catherine's late mother's music school, had come with its own share of excitement and apprehension. The first few days he spent at the school were quiet, reflective. He had walked through the halls, run his hands across the old wooden floors, and paused to study the faded photos on the walls, images of young musicians. Students who had once walked through these very doors, full of dreams and hope. Harmony House had once been a beacon for kids from all backgrounds, offering them not just musical education, but a sense of belonging, a way to express themselves when the world tried to silence them. But since Catherine's mother had passed, the school had fallen into disrepair, its vibrant halls now empty and dusty. The piano, which had once been a centerpiece, stood silent, a shell of what it had been. Catherine had told him how her mother had sacrificed everything to keep the school running, using the earnings from her own performances to fund scholarships for underprivileged children. It was a legacy that Catherine now felt responsible to revive, and she knew that David's talents were the key to unlocking the school's future. David had begun teaching a few students, each with their own stories, their own struggles. There was Jasmine, a shy 12-year-old who clutched her violin case like a lifeline. Her peers at school made fun of her for practicing in public, so she had retreated into the quiet spaces of Harmony House. Then there was Carlos, a 17-year-old with a natural gift for piano, but a temper that often got the best of him. He had been through several foster homes, each one leaving him more guarded, more withdrawn. But music, David could see, had a way of breaking through the walls he had built around himself. The first lesson David taught was simple, but it was more than just about technique. He spoke to his students about finding their voice, not just in music, but in life. He shared with them the story of his grandmother, the woman who had believed in him when no one else did, the woman who had told him that a gift is meant to be shared. He encouraged them to believe that they, too, had something valuable to offer, regardless of their past, regardless of the limitations society tried to impose on them. For the first time in years, David felt the weight of his own past lifting. He had always believed that his own dreams had been deferred beyond repair, that he had missed his chance to make something of himself as an artist. But here, in this old building filled with music, he found that his purpose was not just to sing. It was to teach, to help others find the courage to pursue their dreams, to heal through music in the way he had once dreamed of doing for himself. It wasn't just the students who were learning and growing. Catherine, too, had begun to transform. She spent more time at the school, helping David prepare the space for its reopening, overseeing the renovation work that had slowly begun to breathe new life into the old building. She had become more than just a businesswoman. She was a woman rediscovering the legacy of her mother, and she was beginning to understand the power of music not as an accessory to her wealth, but as a force that could heal, that could change lives. Together, they worked on the grand reopening of Harmony House. It was a humble affair at first, an evening filled with music, students performing pieces they had worked hard to perfect, showcasing the new energy that had returned to the space. There was no pomp, no fanfare, just a simple celebration of what was beginning to take shape. David sat at the piano, his fingers moving gently over the keys. He was no longer just a waiter, no longer just a man carrying the weight of unrealized dreams. He was a teacher, a guide, a mentor, and as he played, he felt the presence of his grandmother with him, just as it had been that first night when he had sung Amazing Grace. He could hear her voice in his mind, telling him that this was why he had been given his gift, not to keep it hidden, but to pass it on. Catherine, standing in the back of the room, watched David play. Her eyes glistened with pride. She had never expected to find herself here, back at the school her mother had cherished, working alongside the very man who had forced her to confront her own biases, her own regrets. But as she watched David, she realized that the school was not just a building, it was a living, breathing testament to the power of second chances, to the belief that music could change the world, one note at a time. The evening ended with the gentle murmur of students and parents, their voices filled with excitement and hope for the future. The school was alive again. And so was David. He had found his purpose. Not in fame or accolades, but in the small, quiet moments of teaching, of guiding, of helping others to find their own voice. The music he had once hidden was now a beacon for those who needed it most. And in that moment, David realized that the transformation he had longed for, the redemption he had fought for, was not just for him, it was for everyone who walked through the doors of Harmony House. As the night wore on, Catherine found herself standing next to David, watching the students, the future of the school, laughing and talking. "Do you think we can really do this?" she asked. Her voice soft. David smiled, his gaze lingering on the students. "We already have," he said, "and this is just the beginning." As the months passed, Harmony House flourished, its halls filled with the vibrant sounds of music and the laughter of students. David's teachings had transformed not only his students but also himself. He no longer saw his gift as something buried or forgotten, but as a tool to connect, to heal, and to give others the chance he had once dreamed of. Each lesson was a step toward reclaiming the future he thought had been stolen from him. Catherine, too, had found herself on a journey of transformation. No longer the woman driven solely by power and status. She had embraced the legacy her mother had left behind, becoming an advocate for the voices that had long been silenced by privilege and prejudice. One evening, as the sun set over the now renovated building, Catherine and David stood together outside Harmony House, looking at the students inside, practicing and preparing for a recital. The school was more than just a place to learn music. It had become a sanctuary for those who needed to be heard. A beacon of hope for the marginalized and the forgotten. Catherine turned to David with a smile. "We did it," she said softly, her voice filled with pride and gratitude. David nodded, his eyes filled with the same quiet joy. "No, we didn't do it alone. We did it with every note, every lesson, and every student who walked through those doors. Together, they had created something lasting. Something that transcended the barriers of race, privilege, and circumstance, and in doing so, they had changed not only their lives but the lives of countless others." If this story has moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel for more life stories. Together, we can continue to celebrate the power of transformation, the importance of second chances, and the belief that every voice deserves to be heard.